I don't know. What do you think, Ted? What do you mean, what do I think? I have to ask you, What do you think of the T-shirt? You know what I think of this T-shirt. It's the best T-shirt ever. I'm just jealous because you've got such a delicious cup of tea and I can't drink tea. Well, I do have a delicious cup of tea. It's even more delicious because I'm drinking it from a Grove Adventure Playground mug. Watch this space for more information. Click like and subscribe. Haha. Don't think like and subscribe. Anyway. How you doing, Ted? I'm good. Hey, Ted's good. I'm good. I'm drinking a nice cup of tea from this Grove Adventure Playground mug. Hey. Anyway, today's story. Hello, hope you're doing very well. I'm here with my lifelong friend, Big Ted, and his lovely Grove Adventure t-shirt designed by one of our kids. And today we are reading Mr. Rude. Mr. Rude by Roger Hargreaves. I wonder what this is all about then. You excited, Mr. Ted? Big Ted's excited. I'm excited. Let's jump in with Mr. Rude. Mr. Rude is rude. He is very rude. He is very, very rude. He is worse than very, very rude. He is extraordinarily rude. When you meet somebody, you might think to yourself that that person has a large nose, but you wouldn't say anything to them, would you? Because that would be rude, wouldn't it? Well, Mr. Rude would just blurt it out. Big nose! But he wouldn't stop there. Oh no, not Mr. Rude. Big nose! With a nose like that, you could vacuum the floor. Can you imagine saying that to someone? Well, I hope you can't. And he was the same with everyone. If he met someone overweight, he would shout, "Fatty, you're supposed to take the food out of the fridge, not eat the fridge as well." When he was driving along in his car, he would yell rude things at the people he passed by. Mr. Rude... Mr. Rude was a horrible man who didn't have a nice thing to say to anyone and, not surprisingly, no one liked him. What's that, Ted? Stop laughing. Yeah, I should stop laughing. It's not funny being so rude. No one liked him. Sorry. One day, Mr. Rude met Little Miss Tiny, or not so much, met as nearly trod on her. "Good morning," said Little Miss Tiny. "Look at the size of you!" exclaimed Mr. Rude. "Squirt, you're so tiny I could squash you under my thumb." Poor Little Miss Tiny burst into tears and ran home. That's not nice. Behind a tree on the other side of the lane, Mr. Happy looked anything but happy. He had heard everything. The next morning, Mr. Happy was outside Mr. Rude's house, suitcase in hand. Mr. Happy knocked on Mr. Rude's front door. "Go away!" shouted Mr. Rude. Mr. Happy knocked again. Mr. Rude opened the door. "Can't you read?" said Mr. Rude, pointing to his doormat. "Go away!" Mr. Rude's doormat did not say welcome like everyone else's doormat. Mr. Rude had crossed out welcome and then in large black letters had written "Go away" underneath. Mr. Happy smiled, barged past Mr. Rude and went into the living room. "Get out!" shouted Mr. Rude. Mr. Happy smiled an even larger smile and sat down in the armchair. Mr. Rude exploded. He ranted and raged for half an hour. But Mr. Happy calmly sat through it all, smiling. Eventually, Mr. Rude went into the kitchen to make himself supper, without offering any to Mr. Happy. After his supper, Mr. Rude ranted and raged for a full hour. But whatever Mr. Rude called him, Mr. Happy took no notice. Finally, Mr. Rude turned out the lights and went upstairs, without offering Mr. Happy a bed for the night. When he came down in the morning, Mr. Happy was still there, still smiling. "Okay, I give in," cried Mr. Rude. "What do you want?" "Breakfast would be nice," said Mr. Happy. "Please." Mr. Rude made breakfast for him. It was the first time in Mr. Rude's life that he had ever done anything for someone else. In fact, it was the first time he had ever asked anybody what they wanted. "Thank you," said Mr. Happy when he had finished. "Right, you can go now," demanded Mr. Rude. But Mr. Happy did not budge. Mr. Rude ranted and raged and raged and ranted. But he ended up making lunch for Mr. Happy and supper. He even offered Mr. Happy a bed that night. Mr. Happy stayed for a fortnight. Big Ted, that's 2 weeks a fortnight. Slowly, the ranting and raging became less and less. Mr. Rude discovered he had something that he had never known he possessed. Manners. When it was time for Mr. Happy to leave, he shook Mr. Rude's hand and said, "Thank you so much, Mr. Rude. I really enjoyed my stay." Mr. Rude beamed a smile that was every bit as wide as Mr. Happy's, and found himself saying, "And so did I." Mr. Rude was a changed man. "Burp, burp," belched Mr. Rude. "Well, almost." What do you think, Ted? Well, I thought that was pretty great. He went from being Mr. Rude to actually Mr. Quite Polite. So it's a good proof, good little story that anyone can change. So if you are feeling a little bit rude, why am I locked down? Hey, everyone's locked down. So, hey, turn it around, turn that frown upside down, and do something nice for somebody else and see if it makes your day a little bit better. This is Ollie for Grove Lockdown TV. Until next time, subscribe. See you later.